The roots of the conflict. When the Federation of Nigeria became independent in 1960, its sponsors launched it, hopefully, as a showcase of Western democracy in Africa. It had one central and three regional parliaments, complete with their upper and lower chambers, and there was an opposition of sorts. The key figures in power had been carefully selected and trained by the colonial administrators before their departure. The world noted with interest that the judges wore wigs and the constitution provided for basic human rights. Everything seemed ready for Nigeria to continue along the carefully prepared course into which she had been propelled. The certainty with which this was assumed in certain British circles was connected with the fact that the backward Muslim North was large both in area and population than the other two regions combined. This gave northern Nigeria a built-in predominance over the rest of the federation, a predominance which would be used as a brake should the more progressive west and east develop any radical leanings. The former colonial officials who stayed behind as advisors and other vested interests both found this to be a reassuring factor. Some voices in London even suggested that Nigerian independence would prove that Lord Lugard and his policy of indirect rule had been right. When Lugard arrived in northern Nigeria at the turn of the century to establish British authority, he found powerful emirates with established administrative and tax collection systems. Lugard, who was as short of administrative officers as he was of funds, left the emirs to rule much as they had done before, subject to British control. In return for their cooperation, he promised to interfere as little as possible with their traditional authority, and in particular that he would respect their Muslim religion and way of life. Christian missionaries were restricted to the pagan areas of the north. The effect of all this was to stop the clock. Emirs who before the advent of British rule had to keep the demands they made on their subjects within the bounds of public tolerance, became tyrants when their positions were made secure by the armed strength of the colonial forces. They no longer needed the consent of those they governed, and any threat to their status quo was interpreted by them as a threat to Islam, the Muslim way of life, which Lugard had promised to respect. In this way, no outside influence was allowed to impinge on the growing stagnation of their parochial domains. As late as 1958, the members of the British Whaling Commission remarked that the northern region has remained behind the protective wall of the colonial government as an Islamic society, singularly unaffected by change in the rest of the world. Islamic law of the Maliki school is administered, Purdah is observed by women, and Western innovations are in some quarters regarded with disfavor. The most fatal effects of this policy were on education, which for a long time had remained exclusively in the hands of the missionaries, whose activities were restricted in the north. While the south was comparatively well provided with schools, the Muslim north had practically none until World War II. Much of the critical and technical staff required in northern Nigeria had therefore to be imported from the other regions, and the presence of these foreign clerks gave rise to friction, which became acute when Southerners were appointed to senior civil service posts formerly occupied exclusively by the British. This coincided with the political awakening of the northern elites, the emirs, their courts, and their senior officials, and the northern region political parties from their inception preached against the danger of a southern invasion. The most successful southerners, and therefore the most intensely disliked, were the eastern region Igbos. Despite the post-war provisions of schools in the north, the supply of educated northerners remained extremely limited, and half-trained northerners often replaced well-qualified southerners even in the most responsible posts. This was part of the northernization policy, which was much resented elsewhere in Nigeria, particularly because it gave preference to expatriates imposed from Britain and elsewhere at enormous costs, despite the fact that Nigerians from the East and the West with equal and sometimes better qualifications and experience had applied for the posts. The Northerners preferred Europeans to their countrymen from the South, and the people they disliked most were the Igbos. This was reflected quite clearly in the preoccupation shown by most members of the Northern legislature. For instance, during a debate in the House of Assembly in Kaduna during March 1964, the regional government was asked to revoke forthwith all certificates of occupancy from the lands of the Igbos resident in this region. Another member wanted the number of Igbos working in the post offices reduced. There are too many of them in the north. I think they were just too dangerous to the region. Others protested about the allocation to Igbos of government contracts, market stalls, and land. One representative simply called for the Igbos to be sent back to the east. We do not want to have another trouble leading to bloodshed, as we hear happening in other places. These and many similar remarks might be written off as irresponsible had the northern government not encouraged them. The Northern Region Premier, Sir Ahmadu Bello, replied to the debate by reassuring the House that it was his most earnest desire that every post in the region, however small, is to be filled by a Northerner, and the Minister of Land and Survey, Alhaji Ibrahim Musa Gashar, said he would do all he could to see that members' demands about Igbo land holdings were met. How to do this? When to do it? All this should not be disclosed. In due course, you will all see what will happen. These developments were clearly the result of the isolationism and the educational disadvantages which indirect rule fostered. The colonial government's respect for northern traditions and religion, which had developed from a policy into a fetish, had the effect of turning Islam into a fanatical kind of northern nationalism. In 1942, the West African Students' Union in London appealed to the Conference of Northern Chiefs for cooperation with the South on problems affecting Nigeria as a whole. The emirs reacted to this by stating that the country could not be held together except by means of the religion of the Prophet. If they want political unity, let them follow our religion. The Western Nigerian leader, Chief Awolowo, now Commissioner of Finance in the Nigerian government, pointed out in 1947 that Southerners who go to the North to work or trade have to be segregated, whereas Hausas are free to mix as much as they wish in the South. The seed for a further minority problem in the North had been sown by the government. It will grow with growing political consciousness on the part of those who settle permanently in the North. When the bitter harvest came to be reaped, as surely it must, unless the present policy is changed, the British government should bear the blame. Lugard left northern Nigeria in 1906 but returned in 1912 as governor of the Protectorate of Northern Nigeria and the Colony and Protectorate of Southern Nigeria, with instructions to amalgamate them into one administrative unit. One of the reasons for this step was to extend the railway from the south to the landlocked north, another to subsidize the north, which was not self-supporting, out of southern revenues. But amalgamation did not bring unity, nor was it supposed to. Lugard said that his task was to unify administrations, not peoples, and he insisted in retraining the separate identity of southern and northern Nigeria, despite strong advice to the effect that this would make the future of the country as a single entity very difficult. How well he succeeded in keeping the South and the North apart is evident from the remark made 33 years later by Alhaji Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, subsequently to become the Prime Minister of the Federation. Since the amalgamation of southern and northern provinces in 1914, Nigeria has existed as one country only on paper. It is still far from being unified. The disunity of Nigeria, which lies at the roots of the present Nigeria-Biafra conflict, therefore, was not simply a matter of tribal and religious differences. It was the result of a deliberate colonial policy. After the amalgamation, it was decided to introduce indirect rule into southern Nigeria, but the attempt was only partly successful. The Yorubas of western Nigeria had a strong chieftaincy system, but their Obas, who traditionally depended on the advice of their fellow chiefs, were not autocratic rulers and therefore not comparable to northern Nigeria's Hausa Fulani emirs. Although the Obas were made secure against their fellow chiefs by colonial legislation in the 1930s, their authority was later sapped by the growth of political parties operating through local councils. In eastern Nigeria, now Biafra, there were no chiefs. Unlike the Hausas of northern Nigeria and the Yorubas of western Nigeria, the empire builders of the pre-colonial days, the Igbos lived in small administrative entities, the village groups, until the arrival of the British at the turn of the century. The thick forest which covers most of their country was, and evidently still is, an excellent defense against the outside invasion, but it did not make for easy communication or large political formations. The villages within each group or town were related by descent, and each was divided into umunas, groups of extended families with common ancestry. The administration at the various levels of this pyramid was carried out by consuls presided over by senior men who held office by virtue of their personal ability as much as age or lineage. The councils enforced regulations which were traditionally binding, and units were held to be collectively responsible for the conduct of individual members. Matters of village or town concern the clearing of roads or land disputes were settled at meetings to which all constituent councils sent representatives. The executive function of government were performed by age grades into which all members of the community belonged by birth. Junior grades were responsible for social services such as sanitation, whilst senior grades usually dealt with vital questions of peace and war. There was an intensely competitive spirit between the grades. At the broadest level, every male member of the community was represented and responsible for decision making. In political principle, therefore, the Igbo village groups were strictly comparable to the Greek city-states. What is more, this democratic tradition survived the advent of colonial rule and later the institution of a modern parliamentary system. What has been said about the Igbos also applies to the Ibibios, Biafra's most important minority tribe. The two ethnic groups have been linked for centuries through trade, ritual ties, marriage, religious practices, and military alliances. The Igbos and the Ibibios cannot tolerate anyone assuming the authority of a chieftain over them, wrote Chief Awolowo. For this reason, the experiment of warrant chiefs in eastern Nigeria failed. The attempt by the colonial administration to create chiefs where none had existed before almost destroyed Biafra's village democracies. The British intention to institute indirect rule had to be abandoned in eastern Nigeria, but not before Western education and the resulting migration from village to city did its share in breaking down the traditional way of doing things. Between the two world wars, it looked as if rural society in eastern Nigeria was doomed to stagnation, but the village group tradition was too strong to be killed. The early 40s saw the rise of patriotic and progressive unions, associations of people from the same village group who had moved to the larger towns and cities. They kept their members in close touch with village affairs, and many of them took an active part in regulating the affairs of their towns. They were often well endowed. Many of their members were successful traders or professional men, and their impact was remarkable. For example, the Patriotic Union of Enugu Ukwu, a small town near Oka, the scene of some of the heaviest fighting in the war, built a market, a post office, and an important hospital. It also settled local litigation and performed local government. A scientific study of Uboma, a village in central Biafra, found the Uboma Progressive Union to be the most important modern organization in Uboma, affecting the life of the community. A 1948 Nigerian government review of education recorded that the Inewi Union, General Ojuku's hometown, had erected permanent buildings for 10 large schools within 2 years. It will be difficult to overestimate the power of the community in Inewi district, or indeed in any of the developed areas in the eastern provinces. The people of the eastern region started later than the western region, Yoruba, at least in the field of education, But the Yoruba head start was not permitted to last. A report by the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development in 1954 notes that over 500,000 of 1.5 million children of school-going age attended classes, the highest proportion of any region. The popular enthusiasm for education probably runs higher in the East than in any other part of Nigeria. There were good reasons for this. The traditional Igbo society, with its emphasis on competition and ability, provided incentives for individual achievements. The dynastic political organizations elsewhere provided much less personal scope. But the most important modern factor is undoubtedly the land shortage. Biafra is the most densely populated area of Africa outside the Nile Valley. 420 people per square mile compared with the overall Nigerian figure of 156. And the shortage of farming land forced thousands to seek employment in the cities every year. This is why 2 million Eastern Nigerians lived outside their own region, mainly in the north. Nigerians' constitutional development up to independence was marked by Western and Northern threats of secession if their various conditions for Nigeria's future were not met. In 1953, for instance, the Yorubas opposed the move to separate Lagos, the federal capital, from the Western region, and Chief Awolowo's party, the Action Group, unequivocally threatened to secede from Nigeria over this issue. Awolowo challenged the British colonial secretary to deny that the people of the Western region have the right of self-determination and are free to decide whether or not they will remain in the proposed Nigerian Federation. The case of the North was different. It feared Southern competition in public and private employment. Landlocked, it feared economic strangulation by the Southern Nigerians, and its ruling elite, the aristocracy, had provided its politicians, feared the egalitarian influence of the political parties in the South. Britain's colonial presence seemed the only assurance against this danger, and the last thing the Northerners wanted was independence. Tafawa Balewa declared in 1947, "We do not want, sir, our southern neighbors to interfere in our development, but I should like to make it clear to you that if British quitted Nigeria now, at this stage, the northern people would continue their interrupted conquest to the sea." In 1950, at the General Conference in Ibadan, the emirs of Zaria and Katsina announced to the conference that unless the northern region was allotted 50% of the seats in the central legislature, it will ask for separation from the rest of Nigeria on the arrangement existing before 1914. The North got its way on this point, thereby gaining its inbuilt majority in the federal parliament. It used this majority 3 years later to defeat a motion by Chief Enahoro, the present Nigerian Commissioner for Labor and Information, demanding the attainment of self-government for Nigeria in 1956. Chief Enahoro had the support of the entire South. Sir Ahmadu Bello subsequently recalled that there were agitations in northern Nigeria at the time for secession, adding, "I must say it looked very tempting. We were certainly viable. To use the current phrase, we could run our own show. The center would have to hand over to us our share of Nigeria's accumulated sterling assets. We had the men and production and minerals and the will to act. The North was only deterred from breaking away, he explained, by the fear that an unfriendly South might cut off the landlocked region's exports and communications. But the South campaign for self-government in 1956 continued, and on May 16, 1953, anti-Southern rioting broke out in Kano, and in 3 days of violence, 40 people died and 240 were injured. The immediate cause was an action group conference held in the city, and it is interesting to note that although this party was based on the Yoruba West, most of the victims were Eastern region Igbos. The real cause of the riot was the northern fear of southern political demands and of the relentless approach of independence. On May 23rd, the North came up with a new constitutional proposal instead. This consisted of an 8-point plan, which was in effect a demand for secession of the North from the South, allowing only for an economic or customs union between the two. It envisaged almost complete executive and legislative autonomy, suggesting instead of a federal government, a central agency responsible only for the defense, external affairs, customs, and research institutions. The Northern Plan was dropped on British advice, but the London Constitutional Conference of July-August 1953 agreed to some devolution of political powers from the center to the regions. Nevertheless, it is interesting Sir Ahmadu described the 8-point plan as a compromise on the suggestion of secession from Nigeria, adding, "It was a novel idea developed in general party discussions and it might have worked." The Biafran proposal for the future association between Nigeria and Biafra are not dissimilar, and the very people in the North who cheered in 1953 when Sir Ahmadu launched his plan now would want to wipe Biafra off the face of the earth rather than consider similar proposals. But it should be noted that Eastern region throughout this period campaigned for national unity and against the separatist tendencies of its partners in the North and West. Professor Kalu Ezera, a prominent Nigerian, wrote in 1959 that Nigeria remains one country today, partly because the British administrative superstructure and partly because of the NCNC ideology of one Nigeria. The National Congress of Nigerian Citizens was partly led by Dr. Azikiwe, later Nigeria's first president. It was largely, though by no means entirely, Igbo and based on the Eastern region. The last important development before independence was the arrival in Nigeria in 1957 of a British commission led by Sir Henry Willink to investigate the fear of the minorities. Each of the regions was dominated by an ethnic group: the Hausas in the north, the Igbos in the east, the Yorubas in the west, but each also contained numerous smaller tribes which had long agitated for separate statehood. However, by far the most serious problem lay in the Middle Belt, the non-Hausa and non-Muslim part of the north adjoining the eastern and western regions. The northern government had experienced trouble, especially from the thieves, and had tried to suppress this by the use of force. But the British officials in northern Nigeria were as eager to prevent a Middle Belt state as the northern leaders. In May 1957, Sir Brian Sherwood Smith, the governor of northern Nigeria, wrote to Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, the federal prime minister, a northerner, of course, The utterly irresponsible behavior of a relatively small handful of people has transformed the self-seeking demands of a few dispersed groups, each with its own axe to grind, into the beginnings of a widely spread movement covering in some degree all the riverain provinces. If this was allowed to continue, pressure for new states in Midwest and Delta areas would increase, and if there was to be a multiplicity of regions with wide powers, the case for regionalization will disappear, and Nigeria would inevitably return to a unitarian form of government, on the effects of which on the North it is unnecessary to comment. This letter contains 2 points of interest. Firstly, the northern fear of unitary government, which caused the massacre of Easterners in May 1966, was fostered by the British. Secondly, the Eastern Nigerian minorities in the Delta were then regarded by the British officialdom as belonging to a few dispersed groups and their leaders to a relatively small handful of people who behaved irresponsibly. The official British position in this war, by contrast, has been one of full support for Nigeria in her claim, one of many, that the war was started to save these same minorities from Igbo domination. The Minorities Commission recommended against the setting up of further regions or states. Thus, Nigeria started independence as a political tripod. If you take one leg away, it collapses. At the center, it was run by a coalition of the Eastern NCNC and the Northern NPC, and the NCNC leader, Dr. Azikiwe, who handed the office of Eastern Region Premier, which he had occupied, to Dr. Opara, became Governor General, and later, when Nigeria turned into a republic, its first president, a ceremonial office without political power. This was in theory wielded by the Prime Minister, Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, a northerner, but the real power was in the hands of the Northern Regional Premier, Sir Ahmedu Bello, and leader of the NPC, who contemptuously referred to Sir Abubakar as "my deputy." The Western AG had refused to turn the coalition into a national government by joining it, and the AG leader, Chief Awolowo, handed the Western Nigerian Premiership to Chief Akintola and came to Lagos to become leader of the federal opposition. This was a precarious balance, and those who launched Nigeria as the showcase of Western democracy should have known better. In 1962, the federal government used a trivial incident arising out of an internal split in the AG to declare a state of emergency in the Western region and put its leaders, including Chief Awolowo, under restriction. Sir Abubakar appointed a personal friend, Dr. M. Majekodunmi, the Nigerian Minister of Health, as administrator of the Western region. Later that year, Awolowo and other AG leaders were arrested and charged with plotting to overthrow the government by force. They were convicted the following year. One leg of the political tripod had been removed by blatantly undemocratic means. Tafawa Balewa was openly scornful of the role of the opposition. Yet, in Britain and in the USA, these events hardly impinged on the belief that Nigeria, the most populous and potentially the most powerful African state, had a great and democratic future. The conflict with Biafra has many roots. Lugard's policy of indirect rule is one of the deepest, but the events in Western Nigeria since 1962 provided the immediate cause for the first military coup. With the removal of Awolowo, a faction of the AG, led by Chief Akintola, broke away and eventually formed a new party, the NNDP, which allied itself with the NPC in the north. When the state of emergency was lifted, Akintola resumed his position as Western Nigerian Premier, but this office had been his only by virtue of his AG support, which he no longer enjoyed. Thus, the majority party, to which an estimated 80% of Western Nigeria voters were committed, was deprived of power through a political coup in the region, a situation which gave rise to increasing unrest. The federal government took the opportunity of further reducing Western Nigeria's strength by creating a separate region for its non-Yoruba minorities, the Midwest. The alliance between the NCNC and NPC, always a shaky one, came to an end before December 1964 federal elections, the first since independence, and in the new political lineup, the Western AG formed an alliance with the Eastern NCNC, while the NPC relied on whatever support Chief Akintola's NNDP could muster among the Western region Yorubas. But the elections campaign was marked by intimidation of opposition candidates, particularly in the north and in the west, and by open electoral malpractices, including the kidnapping of prospective candidates to prevent them from completing their nominations. And as a result, a large number of official candidates stood unopposed. On the eve of the election of the NCNC, AG Alliance called on the supporters not to vote, and in most of the East and parts of the West, there was an almost total boycott of the polls. The effect was a landslide victory for the NPC NNDP alliance, but the NCNC AG front urged President Azikiwe to declare the result invalid and appoint a caretaker government until fresh elections could be held. This the president might have done he been assured of the loyalty of the armed forces, which he was not. After some days of crisis, he called on Tafawa Balewa to form a new government, but announced that it would be broad-based. This was part of a compromise which also allowed the constituencies which had boycotted the elections another chance to vote, and which promised a review of the constitution. It is interesting that this provision, which had been intended primarily to improve the electoral apparatus, was seized on by the Northern Premier, Sir Ahmadu, to announce that any proposal to insert a secession clause will get his support. At the same time, a section of Sir Ahmadu's NPC was planning to dismember the East for sake of its revenues. An outline of this plot, written shortly before the January 1966 coup by a British observer who now supports the federal cause, reveals that a section of the NPC stressed that if the East made a single further move, they would organize a riot, declare a state of emergency in the East, and give the NCNC the treatment that had been meted out to the AG. After May 1962, all the details placing the Eastern leaders under restriction, investigating the financial administration of the region and the sources of party finance, and finally, the emasculation of the East by creating a separate river state were openly canvassed. A river state will cut the region in bits and remove all the oil revenues. This provides an interesting insight into the motives for which the war is being fought. But in 1965, the East and its AG alliance in the West still relied on constitutional methods. In particular, they hoped that the regional elections in western Nigeria, which Chief Akintola could no longer avoid, would prove their popular support. In the event, the elections were rigged even more blatantly than the federal allocations, and despite the obvious loyalty of the large majority of the electorate to the AG and its alliance and its allies, the NNDP was returned to office. In the widespread disillusionment at the failure of the polls, political discontent gave rise to widespread violence and unrest. At the beginning of 1966, the Western region was in a state of near anarchy, and there were rumors that Sir Ahmadu Bello and Chief Akintola were planning to take over the whole federation with the help of the armed forces. This then was the situation on the eve of the first military coup. The group of army officers which had which was responsible for the attempt acted to end the misrule which had fostered tribalism, regionalism, and corruption, which had invaded almost every sector of the public life. Politicians had fallen into universal contempt. Nigeria had lost its sense of purpose. There is no doubt that the coup was widely popular. People felt that they had been released from an intolerable burden. Even 3 years later, the Nigerian press recalled that many Nigerians believed joyously that a new era had dawned. Unfortunately, this is not the view taken by the men who rule Nigeria today. For instance, Chief Anthony Enahoro, the leader of the Nigerian delegation, told the 1968 peace conference in Addis Ababa that to most Nigerians, the incidents of January 15th were a clumsily camouflaged attempt to secure Igbo domination of the government of the country. This impression was later reinforced by certain appointments and actions of the new regime under Major General Ironsi, himself an Igbo. It is of course true that most of the young majors who led the January coup were Igbos. There was a high percentage of Igbos in the commissioned ranks of the Nigerian army. It is also true that most of the victims were non-Igbos, and this is not surprising, considering that the Northerners and their Western region allies dominated the corrupt and politically bankrupt establishment, which was the coup's target. There was more to it than that, of course. The coup was an extremely complex affair with a confusion of motives. What matters is that it failed. Sir Ahmadu Bello, Chief Akintola, and Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa lost their lives. While it is improbable that the killing of the two regional premiers was accidental, the death of the Prime Minister seems not to have been planned. Major General Aguiyi Ironsi, the general officer commanding Nigerian Army, who was among those to be eliminated, escaped with his life and assumed power at the formal request of the panic-stricken federal government. General Ojukwu, then still a major, was in Kano on January 15th and played no part in the controversy. Ironsi appointed him soon afterwards as military governor of Eastern Region. As Nigeria's political troubles were clearly the result of the country's regional imbalance, the Ironsi regime decided to abolish the regions to unify the country. To claim that this was done to allow Igbos to dominate the republic is to ignore the fact that only three of the nine members of the Supreme Military Council, which promulgated the unification decree, were Easterners. Nevertheless, this idea that unification was part of an Igbo plot was carefully spread in the north by ex-politicians, civil servants, and the local press. This has been admitted even by the present federal government in an official publication which blames in particular local petty contractors and party functionaries whose livelihood depended on political party patronage for resorting to whispering campaigns, rumor-mongering, and incitement. The unification decree was announced on May 24, 1966, and before the end of that month, mass demonstrations in northern Nigeria demanded the immediate secession of the north in preference to Igbo domination, which it was believed unification would mean. Riots broke out in which many eastern residents in the north were killed and thousands fled to eastern Nigeria. Ironsi and the four military governors met in Lagos to discuss the situation. The statement issued after the meeting explained that the unification decree was not meant to affect Nigeria's territorial divisions. This backpedaling cost Ironsi a great deal of support in the east and the west, but it seemed to calm the north, and Ojukwu appealed to the easterners who had fled to return to their posts in northern Nigeria. Many of those who obeyed his call were killed in the massacres a few months later. While the northerners regarded the Ironsi regime as a threat, many people in the south blamed Ironsi for delaying reforms in order not to offend the sensibilities of the north. This feeling was so prevalent that at the end of July 1966, when the first news of a second coup reached London, many Nigerian students assumed that Ironsi had been overthrown by impatient progressive in southern Nigeria. In reality, of course, the July coup was led by northern officers whose aim was either to return the country to its pre-January 15 structure with its inbuilt northern predominance, or, failing that, to lead the North out of Nigeria through secession. It was the old story all over again, and once again, Britain, this time supported by United States, stepped in to prevent the North from carrying out its intention. If Anglo-American diplomatic intervention had not occurred, Colonel, now General Gowon, who came to power as a result of the second coup, would have announced the dissolution of the Federation in the broadcast he made on August 1st, 1966. Even so, he came pretty close to it when he declared, putting all considerations to test, political, economic, as well as social, the basis of unity is not there. The second coup claimed hundreds of Easterners in the armed forces as well as civilians, but it failed to dislodge Ojukwu, who remained in firm control of eastern Nigeria. The northern troops, who formed the bulk of the garrison of the region, were prevented by a handful of loyal soldiers and the police from gaining access to the armory. Signal intercepted by the authorities in Ugu were reported to have revealed that the northern troops under Colonel Adekunle, who later made his name as the Black Scorpion in the command of Nigeria's 3rd Marine Commando Division, had been expected to kill first the Eastern officers and then the Eastern government leaders. On August 9, 1966, during a meeting in Lagos of the regional military governors, representatives, and those of Gowon, it was agreed that immediate steps to be taken to repatriate military personnel to their region of origin. It was also decided to hold an ad hoc constitutional conference of regional delegations to recommend on the future form of association for the different regions. An exchange of troops took place between the North and the East, but despite Yoruba protests, the troops remained in Lagos and western Nigeria, where the coup had succeeded. When the ad hoc constitutional conference met in Lagos in September, there was, at least to start with, agreement with the Eastern view that the events of the previous month had shown the need for a loose form of association. The Western delegation, led by Chief Awolowo, who had been released from prison after the second coup, said that if federalism was unacceptable to the other delegates, they would propose a Nigerian Commonwealth in which Lagos was to be part of the Western region. They also wanted to incorporate a secession clause. History was surely repeating itself. The North, not surprisingly, proposed a number of autonomous states with a central agency. Its proposals were essentially similar to the 8-point plan they had submitted in 1953 and abandoned on British advice. Halfway through the ad hoc conference, the northern delegates performed a complete volte-face and submitted new proposals which stipulated an effective central government. There is no hard evidence of what had caused them to change their minds. Presumably, they had again yielded to the argument that to abandon control over northern Nigeria outlets to the sea, not to speak of southern revenues, would be tantamount to economic suicide. The ad hoc conference might have achieved an acceptable compromise, but it was overtaken by a fresh wave of massacres in the north. There is no doubt that these killings were organized with the specific purpose of driving all the Easterners out of the north. The mobs, which had been fired with horror stories about the Igbos, were hunting Easterners like vermin. The total death roll of 1966 is estimated in Biafra at 30,000. 2 million refugees returned to their region. Nigeria was on the brink of dissolution by the end of the year. The last chance for a peaceful settlement came early in January 1967 when Nigeria's military leaders agreed to meet in Aburi, Ghana to seek a way out of the impasse. The Aburi meeting produced agreement on a surprisingly comprehensive range of subjects. It also led to the disclosure that Ironsi, who had been missing since the July coup, had been killed. If the Aburi Agreement, which was unanimously accepted by all present, including Gowon, had been implemented, Nigeria might have been saved. There is absolutely no doubt about what was decided. Since a verbatim recording of the proceedings signed by all present was accepted and published by both sides, the two versions agree. Put into effect, the agreement would have turned Nigeria into a very loose confederation. As it was, Gowon was advised by his civil servant against the implementation of the agreement on grounds that it would reduce his authority and power over the regions. Nigeria's failure to implement the Aburi agreement drove Eastern Nigeria out of the Federation and caused the war. But the war would never have happened if Britain had not insisted from the start that the federal government in Lagos was the only legal one in Nigeria. The Americans, the Russians, and most other countries, as well as the United Nations and the Organization of African Unity, have taken their lead from Whitehall, and so far only four African countries and Haiti have refused to follow the British example. But Gowon's government in Lagos may have no better claim than that of Ojukwu in the former Eastern region. According to expert legal opinion, the constitutional government of Nigeria ceased to exist after the January 15 coup. There was no provision in the Nigerian constitution which allowed the cabinet to transfer power to the head of the armed forces. However, the Ironsi regime exercised control throughout Nigeria and therefore a de facto government. But the second coup in July did not succeed in eastern Nigeria, and therefore it produced two de facto regimes, that of Ojukwu in the east and that of Gowon in the rest of Nigeria. General Ojukwu's administration is the only one which has continuity with the first military government. General Gowon, who assumed power after General Ironsi was murdered, was not, in terms of seniority, his lineal successor, and Ojukwu never recognized him as such. Some Nigerians have suggested that he did so in January 1967 at Aburi, but there is no trace of this in verbatim records of the proceedings. It has also been said that Ojukwu acknowledged Gowon as supreme commander during one of the two private sessions at Aburi, when the recording machine was switched off. When Susan Kronje saw Ojukwu in Enugu in 1967, she asked him what had been discussed during these interludes. He replied, "We talked about the death of Ironsi. That was the first adjournment. The second one, I do not remember what led to it. What was it?" Kronje asked. "I think it was the question of who should become the supreme commander." Ojukwu replied, "The question of command, yes. It was there we talked generally about joint responsibilities. The question of having a primus inter pares type of chairman. We talked about what is now being referred to as the veto power of the regions." Kronje asked, "Did Gowon's personality come in? I mean, did anybody dispute that he might be elected chairman?" Ojukwu replied, "I think generally throughout the discussions, the others, I thought I would probably dispute his being chairman. I suppose they had good reasons for feeling that way, but I personally did not make that an issue. In fact, after our discussion and after agreeing on what is tantamount to safeguards about whoever is in Lagos, I remember we were all sitting down talking and everybody was happy. We had gone so far when I said, 'Gentlemen, one more thing.' I could see their faces drop. 'What other difficulties is Ojukwu going to place in our way?' they asked. I said, 'Well, after all this, gentlemen, this is only one more thing. There is only one more thing.' They asked, 'What?' I said, 'If the agreements were all implemented, I would then request to have the honor of nominating Gowon as chairman.' This, I think, took them rather by surprise. Everybody exclaimed, 'You will do that?' And Gowon himself got up from his chair opposite me and walked across and embraced me. I said, 'Of course, as long as I was concerned. I was not interested in leaving the East. I never will be, nor after what had gone on. In fact, that is why we walked out from the same session arm in arm. Gowon and myself. It was then that I realized that the personal side did prey a great deal on his mind. I think that throughout he did not realize that this was really a matter of principle. He probably felt that he really was going to lose face over this. But after my offer, our discussions took a different turn. In fact, when he got back to Nigeria, I think that is how they, his civil service advisors, got at him. They immediately started pointing out to him that he had become a rubber stamp. He was nothing. He had no power. Immediately, of course, he reacted. When Gowon's reluctance to implement the Aburi Agreement became clear, the relations between Lagos and Enugu started to deteriorate rapidly. Because of the non-payment of salaries and other monies owing the, owing the East by Lagos, Ojukwu decreed that some of the revenues collected in the East, which were normally transferred to the federal exchequer, were to be retained in the region. Lagos retaliated by freezing the eastern overseas assets, cutting the region's communications, and finally imposing a complete economic blockade. On March 26th, Ojukwu convened a joint meeting of the Eastern Nigerian Consultative Assembly and Council of Chiefs and Elders to consider the situation. And on May 27, Gowon issued a decree dividing Nigeria into 12 states, three of which were to be carved out of the East. The division was clearly designed to court Eastern Nigeria's non-Igbo minorities by grouping them into separate rivers and southern eastern states. The East's central state, which was to remain to the Igbos, was landlocked. Moreover, the Igbo town of Port Harcourt, which rivals Lagos in importance, and other Igbo areas near the coast were to be included in Rivers State, which as a result would have had the Igbos as its largest ethnic group. Nevertheless, Lagos announced that the administration of the coastal strip would be handed to minority leaders. As the Igbo areas of the River State produce a large percentage of eastern Nigeria's oil, this arrangement was hardly surprising. After all, it was what the North had planned all along for the East. It is freely admitted in Biafra that the minorities have been neglected in the past, but the creation of a new provincial system with considerable local autonomy will assure equitable treatment. What the minorities really want cannot be discovered under wartime conditions when disloyalty to whichever side happens to command the ground may be regarded as akin to treason. The Biafrans have offered a plebiscite under neutral provision, but this has been refused by the Nigerians. The 12 states were promulgated on May 27th, and the eastern region assumed its independence as Biafra on May 30th. On July 6th, Nigeria attacked Biafra to initiate what Lagos predicted would be a police action lasting a few days. For the sake of those officials, both in Washington and London, who appeared to be under the impression that Biafra started the tragic conflict, it should be added that Radio Lagos issued the following announcement on July 7, 1967. The Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Nigeria has issued orders to the Nigerian Army to penetrate the East Central State and capture Ojukwu and his rebel gang. Nigeria and Biafra were at war.